Lex Luger seemed to be everything a wrestling promoter could want. He was tall and powerful and looked like he was carved out of stone. On the surface, he looked like the perfect superstar, the kind of athlete who should have ruled the business for years. But behind that image was a man quietly falling apart. The problems that would one day destroy his life didn't start after wrestling. They were there from the very beginning. Luger was born Lawrence Wendell Fowle in Buffalo, New York in 1958. He earned a football scholarship to Penn State, but transferred to the University of Miami after getting into fights with the coaches. After being benched, he lost control and trashed a hotel room, and was then kicked off the team. By the mid-1980s, his football days were behind him. He'd already been introduced to steroids during that time, and he admitted later that the results changed everything. As his body grew, his confidence increased, and the gym became his entire life. While training at a gym in Tampa, he caught the attention of Barry Windham and veteran trainer Hiro Matsuda, who saw potential in his size and look. Matsuda's training was famously brutal. This was the same man who once broke Hulk Hogan's leg just to test him, but Lawrence saw it as a challenge to conquer. Under Matsuda's watch, Lawrence Fowle became Lex Luger. He took the name Lex from the comic book villain Lex Luthor, and Luger from the German pistol used in Magnum PI. Within months of his debut for Championship Wrestling from Florida at the end of 1985, Luger was already being pushed as a star. He won the Southern Heavyweight Championship almost immediately and was being talked about as the future of the business. When he walked into Jim Crockett Promotions in 1987, he was barely 2 years into the wrestling business, but he already looked like a world champion. They called him the total package, and to everyone watching, that's exactly what he seemed to be. The torture rack became his trademark finisher, and from his first night on television, it was clear that the promotion had big plans for him. To make sure the audience saw him as a star, they did something that few newcomers ever experienced. They put him straight into the most prestigious faction in wrestling. Luger replaced Ole Anderson as the newest member of the Four Horsemen, and he was positioned as the powerhouse and enforcer. In July 1987, just months after debuting, Luger defeated Nikita Koloff inside a cage to win the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship. It was his first major title and the biggest win of his short career, but backstage, the other wrestlers thought he was being handed everything on a plate. The resentment towards him was growing fast. By the summer of 1988, Luger was challenging Ric Flair himself for the World Heavyweight Championship. At the Great American Bash, he had Flair trapped in the torture rack, and the title seemed to be just seconds away. But just as Flair was about to submit, the referee stopped the match, claiming Luger was bleeding too heavily to continue. The finish protected Flair, but robbed Luger of the biggest win of his life. It was the start of a pattern that would follow him for years. He was the man who looked unbeatable, but somehow never won when it mattered most. Privately, Luger was growing frustrated. He was headlining shows and selling tickets, but the company still wouldn't trust him with the World Championship. When he eventually won the title, he felt that it didn't mean anything, like he was just holding it until the company decided who they really wanted on top. He later admitted that it left him disillusioned. Even while he was being pushed as one of the biggest stars in wrestling, he just wasn't satisfied. Backstage, the resentment towards him from the other boys was reaching boiling point. His contract was one of the first guaranteed deals in the history of Jim Crockett Promotions, so all of the veterans who were working on nightly guarantees saw him as being arrogant and overpaid, just a bodybuilder who hadn't paid his dues. In just a few years, Luger had done what most wrestlers spend a lifetime trying to achieve, but it never seemed to fill the void. By 1992, he'd had enough, so he negotiated his release and walked away from the company and into the arms of Vince McMahon. But Vince didn't want him to wrestle, not yet anyway. He was launching the World Bodybuilding Federation and he wanted Luger to be the star. It sounded like the perfect fit, the total package representing a company built on physical perfection. For Luger, it was another chance to start over fresh, another reinvention. Then in June 1992, it all came crashing down. A motorcycle accident left him with a shattered arm that doctors barely managed to save. They inserted a steel plate to hold it together, and he was forced to spend months recovering on the sidelines. By the time he was back on his feet, the World Bodybuilding Federation had already gone under, but Vince brought him to the WWF. Bobby Heenan unveiled him as the narcissist, a man so obsessed with himself that he carried around a mirror. He was the perfect embodiment of everything that Vince McMahon loved to promote. Even the steel plate in his arm became part of the act, as he used it to smash his opponents with. On paper, it was a clever repackaging, but the fans didn't seem to buy it. While Luger had the body, he didn't have the personality to make it work, and his in-ring work just wasn't enough to make up for it. And within months, the company dropped the character entirely. But Vince wasn't ready to give up. With Hulk Hogan gone, he was desperate to find a new American hero. On July the 4th, McMahon staged a publicity stunt aboard the USS Intrepid, where a line of wrestlers tried and failed to body slam 600-pound Yokozuna. Then Luger arrived by helicopter, stepped onto the deck, and slammed him to the mat with ease. The narcissist was gone. Now he was made in the USA. From that moment, Luger was pushed harder than anyone in the company. The Lex Express tour saw him travel the country in a red, white and blue bus, meeting fans and cutting patriotic promos. The entire campaign was designed to build him up as the next Hulk Hogan, but there was something missing. The fans just couldn't connect with him. He totally lacked the charisma that was needed to do that job, and Luger hated doing the Lex Express tour, admitting that it left him drained and irritable because he was actually forced to go on an actual road trip across the United States. It wasn't just for the cameras. Everything was building up to a main event at SummerSlam against Yokozuna for the WWF title, and it was expected that Luger was going to win. This should have been his crowning moment, but instead, he won by countout. The title didn't change hands, but just as the ring filled with balloons and confetti, it was as if he'd just won the Super Bowl single-handedly. The fans were left confused, but the truth was that Vince McMahon was losing faith in him. He could see that Luger just wasn't ready for the top spot. From there, the decline was inevitable. He co-won the 1994 Royal Rumble with Bret Hart, but at WrestleMania 10 he failed again, getting disqualified in his title match with Yokozuna. By the following year, he was teaming with the British Bulldog as the Allied Powers, a mid-card tag team that summed up just how far he'd fallen. The Lex Express had come to a halt, and the All-American hero had become an afterthought. At the end of 1995, his contract expired. He wrestled his last match in the company at a house show, then appeared live on the debut episode of WCW Nitro just 24 hours later. McMahon was blindsided. He saw this as a massive betrayal, but Luger wanted another fresh start. He'd seen his run in the WWF as another failure in his career, and the whole experience left him feeling drained. It was Luger's old friend Sting who asked Eric Bischoff to give him a contract offer. Bischoff gave him a lowball deal, assuming he'd turn it down, because he'd remembered Luger from the last time he was in the company and didn't have a great opinion of him. But to his surprise, Luger accepted the offer without hesitation, just to escape the Federation and start over one more time. When he showed up unannounced on the first episode of Nitro, it sent shockwaves through the wrestling business, and nobody saw it coming. And Eric Bischoff was pleasantly surprised. This time around in WCW, Luger came across as calmer, more grounded, and more professional than ever before. Then came the NWO. When Hulk Hogan turned heel and joined Hall and Nash, Luger suddenly became one of WCW's most important soldiers. In the storyline, he was front and centre in the company's fight for survival, standing with Sting against the invaders who were tearing WCW apart from the inside. And on August the 4th, 1997, he reached what should have been the defining moment of his career. Live on Monday Nitro in front of a packed house at the Palace of Auburn Hills, the same arena where he'd failed to win the WWF title 4 years earlier, Luger finally beat Hollywood Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. The crowd went crazy. This was the point in his career where he was finally over with the fans. And for one night, it felt like he'd finally broken the curse. But just 5 days later, he lost the title straight back to Hogan at the Road Wild pay-per-view. It was a perfect snapshot of Luger's entire career, with every high point immediately undercut by another setback. No matter how many times he climbed the mountain, he never seemed able to stay there. By 1998, WCW's creative direction was falling apart, and so was Luger's momentum. He joined the NWO Wolfpack alongside Kevin Nash, briefly regaining some popularity, but it didn't last. He won the US title from Bret Hart one night and then lost it back the next. In 1999, he tried to reinvent himself again. He brought Miss Elizabeth back as his manager, turned on Sting, and formed new alliances with Ric Flair and Buff Bagwell. But by this point, WCW was on its last legs, and no amount of reinvention could save him. When WCW was sold to the WWF in 2001, Luger's guaranteed contract meant that he was paid to sit at home for 3 years, and that is when the real problems started. By this point, he had a lot of money and not much to occupy his time. He'd spent his whole adult life being the total package, and now there was no one to perform for. He later admitted that wrestling had been his entire identity, and once it was gone, he didn't know who he was anymore. And so he slipped into painkiller abuse and drinking heavily. Miss Elizabeth was the only constant in his life. They'd started dating several years earlier, and by the time WCW went under, they were living together. But what started as companionship quickly turned into codependence. They spent their days in a haze of painkillers, alcohol, and late-night destruction. Eric Bischoff later said that both of them were going down the same black hole together, and Luger would later describe them as two drowning people trying to save each other. By 2003, the relationship had become toxic. Police were called to their home after a domestic dispute, and Elizabeth was found with cuts and bruises. Luger was arrested for misdemeanor battery, but he claimed that her injuries came from a fall. 2 days later, he was arrested again for DUI after crashing his car with Elizabeth in the passenger seat. Then in May 2003, it all came to an end. Luger called 911 after finding Elizabeth unresponsive. She was just 42 years old when she passed away. The coroner ruled her death as an accidental overdose after ingesting a fatal mix of painkillers and alcohol. When police searched the house, they found it filled with drugs including steroids, painkillers and growth hormones. Luger was charged with 13 felony counts of drug possession. He pled guilty to the drugs charges and received 5 years of probation, but in 2005 he violated that probation by travelling overseas for a wrestling appearance and was sentenced to 4 months in jail. By his own account, this was the lowest point of his life, and that's where everything changed. In jail, he found God, and for the first time in his life, he let go of the image that he'd spent decades trying to protect. He focused on rebuilding himself through faith and humility. In 2007, he suffered a spinal stroke that left him paralysed from the neck down, but even that became part of his transformation. He later said that it was the best thing that ever happened to him because it forced him to confront who he really was. He never became the wrestler that the world expected him to be, but in the end, he found something far greater. After losing everything, Lawrence Fowle finally found peace.